So, welcome, Dr. Claire Taylor, Associate Professor of Medieval History at the Department of History at Nottingham. I wonder if we could start by perhaps you telling us something about your research.
Okay, so I've got sort of two strands to my research. What I'm traditionally kind of known as is somebody who works on medieval heresy. So by that I mean people who, heretics are people who disagree with what the church is teaching in some form or another. And the very interesting thing about them is not so much what they were teaching, which is interesting, but how the authorities responded to them, and then how they respond to the repression that follows. So specifically, one of the groups that I work on, we call Cathars. There's slight problems with that terminology, but we know them as a group of Cathars, and they're traditionally thought of as people who believed in two gods, bluntly, which is very threatening to the Catholic Church at the time. And they were such a threat that first of all, they were investigated and a lot of them were killed. And then in southern France, the region that I specialise in, there was actually a crusade launched against them. And that was not successful. If anything, that increased the sort of public support for them. And then we have the beginnings of what we call Inquisition. So before the famous Spanish Inquisition, we have the medieval Inquisition, which had the power to summon people to courts in huge numbers, whole villages at a time, and investigate people through terror, threat of torture, isolation, and ultimately the threat of being burned for heresy. That was the ultimate sanction. So it doesn't get much worse than that, really.
Being burned at the stake,
That's
exactly.
right.
Yes. Really, really interesting. And I think one of the important things that you're saying there is that heresy is not a simple black and white story, but rather much more complicated than that. And that's what you're looking at.
Yes, yeah. In fact, to the extent that there's currently a new project which has been launched and is kind of very, in its early stages, but very important, which kind of has the title Blurry Boundaries. Right. And I'm contributing hopefully to that project, in that what I'm finding in the region that I work on specifically, that people aren't either Catholics or Cathars or Waldensians. In reality, they might be different groups in terms of how the authorities are seeing them, but on the ground, you've got lots of people who take what they want from whatever fits their worldview, or answers any kind of particular theological questions or social questions that they've got at the time, or maybe it relates to their sort of political allegiance or their family allegiance. But what I found in Heresy, was the region that I work on, was that individual people would very often be involved with different heresies, and within families as well.
Wow. I mean, really fascinating. And again, this thing about complexity. And I think that part of this is your, I think, really important monograph, Heresy, Crusade and Inquisition in Medieval Heresy. Can you tell us how that changed the way we look at this particular topic?
Okay, well, we'd had this idea traditionally that there were things which we might call Cathar families. And this is because a lot of the very important nobles in southern France, the ones that really kind of come to the fore in the Inquisition documents and in the history of what took place, were families who specifically protected Cathars and were particularly involved with them. And so that was our kind of model, really. What I found in the Heresy region in southern France was this mixture within families. You would have people who were supporting different heretical groups, and these would often be very important noble families as well. So it really breaks down this idea that heresy kind of is transmitted through families. If anything is transmitted through families, it's diversity. Right. in belief, and I think that that is very important, because these days we tend to put people in boxes, yeah. In ideological boxes, yeah. And in actual fact, I think a lot more of it comes down to people finding answers for themselves and questioning as well what these dissident groups are saying, because a lot of what we're finding is of people saying, well, I wanted to decide, which group I liked, so I went and listened to the Cathars, and I went and listened to the Waldensians, and I preferred the Cathars or the Waldensians. But other times people will say, I think they're all good men, is one of the expressions. I think they're all good people. They've all got something to offer, and it might be that they preferred the theological output. They suddenly believed that there was two gods, or it might be that they looked at the lives that people led, and if they led simple lives and they were honest people, then maybe that's why they supported them.
Really, really interesting, and I think that from what you say there, this has real world or modern relevance, surely, because as you're talking about different groups and the way that we look at those now, can you say something about that?
I think what it indicates for the modern world, there's two things of interest really. I think one of them is that when we kind of look at people like political dissidents or people who are kind of challenging society. So anything from Islamic extremism through to stop oil, for example.
Yes.
It means these people are not just in boxes; they individually have their own ideas, and it's very easy to think of people being kind of brainwashed once they enter a radical sect or something like that. But I think in reality, everyone has their own outlook, and everyone has other bits of their lives as well. They're not just focused on that particular campaign or that particular cause necessarily. So I think one of the things that it shows us is that we've to think about individual people's situations, and what has put them in the situation where they have become radicalised in some way or another to one extreme or another, and often that's through learning. It's through books, and we find that with medieval heretics, and it's the same now that people are not necessarily brainwashed. They're reading a lot. They're thinking about ideas. It's not just a gut reaction to the world, or they're led astray by some charismatic leader, for example.
So that you've described, I think, very clearly the research that you've undertaken so far and that you're perhaps most famous for. What are you working on at the minute?
The main thing I'm working on is an event in a town called Avignonnet. Now it seems in southern France that towns were very assertive. They had quite a big sense of their importance. So Avignonnet appears to be the town saying, "Oh, we're Little Avignon," and it was an important centre for heresy. Lots of people there had been investigated right since the beginning of Inquisition in the 1230s. I'm also working, as I mentioned, on this with the blurry boundaries people.
Yes.
Who are, challenging the kind of categories of heretic or aesthetic or just somebody who's called a saint for particular reasons, and looking at the similarities between these people as well as the differences that there might be. I'm also working on medieval travel writing, as I mentioned. So I published a chapter in a book about William of Rubruck, who I mentioned, and another very important medieval traveller, Ibn Battuta.
Yeah.
Who's a Muslim traveller who probably does the most travelling in the Middle Ages, even though Marco Polo is perhaps more famous. Yeah. Ibn Battuta travels throughout the whole Islamic world and beyond. And what's I found was really interesting about the two of them is their response to what they encountered. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm also really interested in looking at Mongols. Now there's lots and lots been written about Mongols, and I have a disadvantage because I don't have the languages. And this is another very important thing about research. You often have to acquire medieval languages, and in the case of the Mongols, they had there's traces of their own language written in the Uyghur script. There's Chinese sources, there's Arabic sources, so I can use the Latin sources. So when you're researching, you have to have some credibility, so you have to really be using sources that you're equipped to read in the original language. You'd know this yourself, obviously. In terms of the sort of fifth thing I'm looking at is looking at Silk Road slavery. So slavery across the region that particularly in the Mongol period, and there's lots of Latin sources. And one thing that I'm finding very interesting is that there's a real difference between the way different types of people who were captured by the Mongols and transported into Mongolia or to wherever they wanted to locate them, in the way that we might categorise them. So typically the Mongols would expand by conquering a town, which they managed to do fairly easily. They were like a huge kind of military machine. And then, very famously, they would get everybody out of the town, and they would look at even things like census accounts and say, to work out who was who. And they would say, okay, oh, you're an engineer, or you're an astronomer, or you're a philosopher or a theologian. You come over this side, we're going to take you. And so we have huge numbers of people who the Mongols captured and used for artisanal or intellectual processes. And they're treated, fairly well. But yes, it's a case of how free were they?
Wow, really interesting. Again, again has modern relevance.
Absolutely.
I think about trafficking of people. Yeah. And you said also that you had some projects that you'd be interested in supervising.
Yes, yeah. So I think there's lots of work that has been done on important towns along the Silk Road, but not really purely from the perspective of foreigners and travellers within them, and including in those groups of travellers would be slaves. And trafficked people. And I think, we've got kind of accounts, administrative accounts and legal accounts of what was supposed to happen in slave markets, for example, but not really looking at the actual experience of those people and the people that were trading them, and the people that were travelling through. Otherwise, they might be pilgrims. If we look at somewhere like Baghdad, one of the most important nodes in religious terms, but also in terms of the economy. So I think in doing comparative focus on some of these sort of maybe 4 or 5 different important nodes for people coming together would be a very fruitful project.
Right, so the Department of History at Nottingham is well known for its research-led teaching. Can you perhaps tell us how your research is woven into your teaching?
Again, I've got the 2 strands really. The heresy strand I've taught particularly a special subject, so which is where the student focuses on the work of or it's the subject is rooted in the research of the supervisor, as you say, and their heresy is very much at the focus of some of the special subjects that I've offered, and some very good student dissertations have spun off from that as well. We've also got an MA module that we run sometimes, which is part of a network that 3 of us here set up, myself and Doctors Rob Lutton and Peter Darby, which is the Medieval Heresy and Dissent Research Network, which looks at heresy in a broader sense. What does it mean? So in different contexts, intellectual heresy, for example, popular heresy, and we held a conference which was quite fun and had some really good outputs. The modules that I've worked up more recently are to do with the interest in travel. And the Mongols. So I have a 2nd year module which is travel and adventure in the medieval world, where we look at travel narratives, but also with a background in economics and what's going on, the geopolitical world and so on. In the 3rd year, a module that I run is called Places, Races and People, and that looks at partly at the emergence of racism in the Middle Ages, because this is a consensus that historians are coming to, is that racism as we know it now is not a huge characteristic of the Middle Ages. People thought more in terms of people's religion or where they came from. The concept of race isn't really a medieval concept, but it definitely begins to emerge in the medieval period. So we look at that a bit as well.
I mean, really, really interesting stuff there. Thank you very much, Dr. Claire Taylor.
Thank you for having me.